Good morning. So thank you very much for coming in to this panel on prospects for justice and reconciliation in the Balkans, which has been put up in partnership with King's College London's War Studies Department. We have a panel of very distinguished speakers, all of whom will be introducing some parts of this topic for about a 4-minute intervention each, after which we will be able to kind of have a bit of a discussion and take some questions also from the audience. So, main topics that we really want to discuss here today is, what is wrong with the concept of reconciliation in practice and in theory? How do we understand it? It's a concept that has had actually a lot of impact and been a lot of repeated in this region in particular, but not only. But it's also a concept that's very poorly understood and that creates significant challenges in practice in terms of how do we actually move ahead with reconciliation, how do we achieve the goals that we're trying to achieve. So we will also be looking at different aspects of reconciliation. We're looking at the different ways of achieving it, for example, through creative arts, through interventions by international community actors, through local interventions, and trying to actually unpack what has been the issue with this. At this stage, I'd like to introduce Professor James Gow of King's College London for his first intervention. James.
Thank you, Ivan. 24 years ago, I had still dark hair, not grey hair, and I was about 30 kilos lighter, and I was a perhaps slightly naive younger man who became involved in a strange adventure. I was approached by the Office of the Prosecutor at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia on the grounds that somebody in the US State Department had told them I might be able to help them, and it turned out indeed I could. And I began a quarter-century journey of dealing with the issues of war crimes and this region. And just as this physical appearance has changed, so has understanding of some things changed. At that point, although it was never a stated objective of the work of the tribunal, there was an implicit understanding that most people shared in discussing it and looking around it, and I was certainly there, that somehow this work involving criminal justice would produce evidence, would produce a narrative that would help to change things during conflict, because the war was still underway, but post-conflict, that we would have a post-conflict peace and justice program to which this project would contribute significantly. And it did so. Whatever else we say, I think we have to be clear that to most people's surprise, given that it was a mere gesture when it began, it made significant achievements, first and foremost by surviving. It also was the first body of its kind, i.e. an international body of some kind dealing with crimes of some kind, to complete all the work it had set itself. All 161 cases dealt with in some way. International criminal law established as part of the realm of our international political diplomatic life. And yet, the slight naivety of that idea that if only you had the evidence, if only the facts were made known, then afterwards everybody would simply understand and would change their views, turned out not to be the case. That 18th century Enlightenment approach based on logic and evidence doesn't necessarily work when you're dealing with large collective bodies of people, people who have deep shaping experiences of one kind or another. And so we see a picture in which this world that I entered became what one of the interlocutors in a bit of research we did called space capsule justice. Something that might as well be the International Space Station. It's out there somewhere, it does its stuff, but the evidence doesn't connect. The evidence even doesn't get to people a lot of the time. And as we confront this kind of issue, then we have to look for other ideas. And one of the ideas might be to look to business. Other ideas are simply looking to ignore things. And a further idea that we've come to, and many others, is looking at the arts. And by looking at the arts, that maybe, if we're lucky, at large symbolic levels, there may be actions that can generate reconciliation of some kind, whatever that is, and we leave that open. Maybe at smaller levels, groups can work together in practice to make things happen. Or maybe, if we only just get to one individual reconciled to their own fate through some kind of activity, through some kind of engagement, then that will be at least some small achievement in an otherwise rather dismal, gloomy scene.
Thank you for keeping to the time quite well. So I'd like to introduce now Rachel Kerr, also from the Department of War Studies at King's College. Rachel.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes. Thank you, Ivan. So as James has said, there's a sense in which reconciliation is still seen as a goal that's some way off, even after significant efforts to enact justice, both internationally primarily and domestically. And that really raises a question of why. Why is there this disconnect between the amount of effort that's been poured in and the results, if you like, that have come out? And we are currently engaged in a research project which seeks to try and probe that question and try and understand what the problem is with reconciliation and what the potentials might be for, as James said, using different approaches to reconciliation. And the project has three broad strands, one on looking at histories, one on practice, and one on discourses. And we're going to talk about the different aspects of the project. Most of us on the panel represent it in some way. So I want to talk about the history strand. One of the main objectives of the research is to find out or find a better understanding of the contested meaning of reconciliation. What is it that we mean when we talk about reconciliation? And that's the key question driving the research. How is reconciliation conceptualized and practiced? And can this enable us to have a better understanding of how it functions and therefore what the opportunities and challenges are in pursuing reconciliation? So why use histories? Why have this strand on history? The first reason is that reconciliation, broadly conceived, is a means of contending with a difficult past. And the problem of how to do that isn't something that suddenly emerged in the 1990s when transitional justice emerged as a field of practice and study, and reconciliation began to be talked about in the context of transitions to democracy and in the context of post-conflict situations. But the problem, the issue of trying to contend with a difficult past, is something that societies have been struggling with for a much longer time. The second reason is that taking a historical approach to this question offers us a potential for a longer perspective and allows for consideration of reconciliation as both a long-term process and one that's not necessarily linear. So it allows us to see fluctuations and disruptions more clearly. And thirdly, taking a historical approach helps us to see contextual complexity in the situations that we look at. So reconciliation itself is, as we've said, a highly contested and a politically contingent domain, and it's dogged by very difficult and possibly irreconcilable or unanswerable tensions and questions around relationships between other highly contested concepts and difficult ideas around peace, justice, truth. So the relationship of all of those with reconciliation and with one another is something that's complex and we hope to capture some of that complexity in the histories. So we're not looking for some sort of universally applicable lessons or a single definition of reconciliation, and we're coming at it with a very open mind as to what it means. And we're certainly not looking for a one-size-fits-all approach to reconciliation, but rather looking for insights from a set of very different contexts into how particular outcomes come about, and what is the process of deliberation that brings them about. So to do this, we commissioned a range of historical studies. There were 14 in total, and they had a huge span, quite diverse, ranging from Athens in the 4th century BC to Spain's current attempts to reopen its conversation about its civil war legacy. And we deliberately tried to avoid those cases that have already been well covered in the literature on transitional justice, and try and disassociate discussions of reconciliation from the particular experiences of the 1990s transitions and post-conflict situations. So in doing all of that, I think we've sort of come up with some broad conclusions, pulling out from the work that's been done. So the first is that reconciliation seems to be understood to be a conservative approach to maintaining or restoring the status quo rather than being a transformative process as it's often assumed to be. But in maintaining a layer of stability, it can also accommodate some disruption underneath. So for example, in Athens, it both worked and didn't work at the same time, so it accommodated this paradox in that while there were serious breaches of the amnesty, civil strife was nonetheless contained. The second conclusion is that reconciliation operates at different levels and strata, which we know. So we've got the state, society, community, individual. And in some instances, there's serious dissonance between those different levels. So for example, between state level reconciliation activity and individual level approaches to it and attitudes towards it. But that dissonance can be accommodated, again, in a framework of reconciliation that is a space for accommodating those sorts of paradoxes and dissonance. In others, reconciliation seems to be an engine of social interaction. So we see reconciliation in the everyday. It's part of how people interact with each other, part of how social relations are carried on. And we've seen that in diverse settings, including, we had a paper on traditional practices in East Africa and on early modern Italy, which you can see very different settings, but the similar sort of process of everyday interaction was occurring. And then thirdly, reconciliation has an overarching political dimension. It can be a politics of distraction, and it's hugely contingent on political context. So we return to the past and we reinvent it in the context of the present. So there's an idea that this sort of process of reconciliation is never done. This process of coming to terms with the past and reinventing memory isn't done because we come back to it, but in the context of the political circumstances of the time. So to sort of end by quoting George Orwell, says, "Whoever controls the past with the present controls the past." And saying how we view the present also dictates how we approach or not the difficult legacy of past abuses. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Jelena, the floor is yours for your 4 minutes.
Thank you. Well, I'll try to address the very provocative question, at least I found it provocative, what is wrong with the concept of reconciliation? Well, to begin with, the terminology. Translate into local languages, the term that we use, usually pomirenje, translates actually into English back to more closely to appeasement. And if you speak to people in the field, if you speak to practitioners, if you speak to intended beneficiaries, you will find that they keep rejecting the terminology, partly because they don't find that it describes the process that they feel should be happening, but also because they have found that this term, reconciliation, has been used and misused over the years, and that the label reconciliation has been slapped onto so many different things that it added additional confusion. Another thing that we could say that is wrong with conceptualizing reconciliation in this region is the fact that every stakeholder, starting from donors, external, bilateral, multilateral, private sector donors, all the way down to practitioners, international, national, non-governmental, governmental, down to intended beneficiaries, have their own views on what is reconciliation and how to achieve it. And these kind of different views create an issue of the actual fact that there is a lack of strategic vision of what reconciliation is, how to achieve it, which brings us to the next issue, and that is the lack of coordination between multiple stakeholders of the process. One thing is very clear, that for some reason reconciliation tends to be perceived as something with an expiry date or something that is expected to happen within a certain period of time, and if it's not achieved within that period of time, the focus of major stakeholders, especially the external funders, tends to move on to a more pressing, or what they perceive to be more pressing issues, instead of seeing reconciliation as actually a multi-generational change and as a process that can be reversed. And sadly, I would even go as far to say that, in my opinion, at least I have been seeing, doing this research in the field, a lot of signs that actually the reversal is happening, and that we are not as far with reconciliation in this region as we could have, or maybe even should have been. And another problem there is a lack of evaluation, with a few notable exceptions. There are really no established, or there is no established practice of using serious evaluation methods which can inform everyone from micro level all the way to the macro level of whether things that are being done to contribute towards reconciliation are actually working. So you have a situation where a lot of external donors, especially external donors, because curiously local governments are much less inclined to fund such activities, which obviously is another one of the problems. A lot of them have been pouring money and resources into the region, funding a range of activities without actually knowing whether any of those activities work, to what extent they work, what kind of impact they create, and have been satisfying themselves with kind of accountability reports, which were both financial, programmatic, but were not focused on actual long-term impact. And most importantly, they weren't looking into whether those activities are producing unintended outcomes, outcomes that were not expected or were not the focus of the project proposals. And what's very important with those outcomes is that they can be both positive and negative. And while intuitively you can look at the project proposal and say, okay, I think that this activity is going to work, it's going to produce a positive effect for that target group of people that we want to reach, if you don't take into account the possibility that you may actually aggravate or worsen the situation or the relationship between other stakeholders of the process, which are not targeted specifically by your project, then you are at risk of creating as many problems as you are creating benefits. This also translates into the lack of a realistic view of not only what has been done, but also what is left to be done, and also how far we got with the reconciliation process, because most of the activities are funded on very short cycles, on yearly cycles, and while it's understandable that those are some of the limitations that those who fund such activities have, the problem with that is, to speak openly, that most of the people dealing with reconciliation are in the non-governmental sector and are actually making a living from doing this work, and they have to work on securing the next grant. The way to do that is to make sure that you satisfy your donor. And how do you do that? By promising that you can do sometimes even more than you can do, but also kind of overinflating the report, or reporting that you did better than you actually did, by omitting any kind of failures or mistakes, which would be a very valuable learning tool, but also by ignoring unintended consequences if there were any. And that leads us to a vicious circle, because in that way you're communicating, you're not allowing space for mistakes, you're not allowing the learning process to happen, you're basically locked into a repetition of projects that you're just assuming are doing what they're supposed to do, but you're also it contributes towards creation, maybe not among the bilateral governmental donors, but among a lot of donors and amongst the public, that reconciliation is much further along than it actually is, which brings us to the next step, that most of the donors will then say, well, if we have achieved so much based upon the reports that we just read, then there is no need for us to allocate this many funds to reconciliation activities, and they will just basically redirect the funds that could have been used to do more on reconciliation into something else. I don't know if I still have time. I don't believe I do, but I hope that it will steer the discussion. Thank you.
Denisa, please.
Thank you. So I always enjoy speaking at this stage of a conference, day 3, because you get ideas and you can refer to other panels. And in particular, I thought what we've heard yesterday in the panel on the US and German engagement with the Western Balkans from one of the distinguished speakers was quite interesting. It was said that reconciliation requires courage by the leaders and commitment by the people. So this statement, I think, reflects the state of play when it comes to reconciliation in the region that is shared equally by policymakers and also by us academics, that very limited progress in this field has been made so many years after the conflict. And this is certainly the case when we think about the elite level. But what's happening actually at the level of ordinary people? So now the question is, how relevant is this level? What happens in the everyday? And I think, again, another speaker, Professor Roger McGindy, made a very strong argument about the importance of the bottom-up processes, which are important not just to find out what's happening among the ordinary people, but also as a very important indicator and even, if you like, a predictor of larger strategic, and you can even say geopolitical processes. So coming back to that observation about commitment of the people, I would like to flip a question a little bit and ask, what is actually the capacity at that level, below level, for reconciliation in the region? And specifically, I would like to refer to 2 findings of the research that we have done at London School of Economics, which is part of the project that has been led by King's College London. So the first finding has to do with the youth. And it's really interesting that when we study youth in this region, the youth is depicted as being actually even more nationalist than their parents' generations, which is kind of almost a paradox, that the people who were not directly involved in the conflict would have, if you like, more radical views or nationalist views about both past and present. And we also know that there are huge problems with education, not necessarily just because it's physically segregated, but because also the content of textbooks. When we approach the study of reconciliation or try to capture what is going on at this level, we found a very interesting development, and that is when the youth are brought together, and in this context we're talking about the youth, Serbian and Albanian youth, they actually end up doing something that could be called reconciliation by stealth. In other words, almost secret reconciliation. They're brought together not even necessarily to discuss the past, and they take their own initiative and they really broach these very, very difficult topics and get involved in these conversations. The second finding of another strand of our research has to do with the RECON process, which is still ongoing in terms of advocacy of the regional civil society groups to establish an interstate commission in the region that would document the facts of war crimes. And you may be aware that there was a lot of hope that this initiative would be backed during the London summit, which didn't come to pass. What we have done, focusing on the RECOM process, we've taken a closer look at the consultation that these civil society groups have had for several years. And they left a trace in terms of transcripts of their conversations that are accessible to everyone. But this sort of volume of records of their conversations is actually too huge and presents a problem that we have as scientists as too much data. So we took a big data approach to these conversations to look at approaching it with the questions: do people speak differently when they meet together at a regional level as opposed to when they meet at the local and a national level? And our study turned up a very interesting finding, is that when people meet at the regional level, they tend to focus more on the issues of peace, of solidarity, of justice and reconciliation. In other words, regional meetings seem to be conducive to putting this kind of reconciliatory dialogue into motion. So just to conclude, so these are kind of two, from our research at least, we can find out that youth and possibly the regional level processes are still sort of areas that should be explored in terms of reconciliation in the region. And secondly, perhaps slightly maybe even disagreeing what has been said so far, I would really hesitate to make very strong judgments about, or assessments about where the region is exactly in terms of reconciliation, because the whole field is a kind of a minefield for study, particularly from a political science perspective. And actually, we do need constant innovation in terms of new methodologies and new ways to understand things, I think, to really capture all the processes that are taking place and to be able to make really a definitive judgment whether, has been progress, what kind of progress, and if there was progress, in which area it was made and why.
Denisa, thank you very much. And now, last but no way least, Eva, the floor is yours. 4 minutes.
Thank you very much. I would like to start this short intervention by asking a question, and that is, how does one measure justice? Now, so many years after the ICTY and the local and regional bodies that dealt with prosecutions, how do you measure what has been achieved in terms of justice? Is it through number of trials or number of convictions? Victim satisfaction? Is it about how many people know judgments or read details about judgments? I always say, as an example, the Karadzic judgment, for example, is 2,600 pages long. How many people in this room or anywhere really read the details of it? So I think that's an important question to begin this discussion with. Also, when it comes to the concept of justice, my sense, after years of working in this field, is that it's a very deeply personal term, and that people come into conversations about it without fully agreeing upon what they mean. And my sense of justice might be completely different from yours. So it also, I think, encompasses an idea that it's about making some things right. And in The Hague, where I work, but also in Bosnia, for example, when you speak to people, there's a sense that some things can never be made right. If someone takes your father to the camp, rapes your mother, and sets your house on fire, there's nothing that can be done to make that right. That's why I think it would be a good idea maybe to think about narrowing the focus and discussing for a change not justice, but criminal accountability when we talk about trials. I think it's narrower, and I think it's easier to pin it down. Thus, talking about putting as many perpetrators on trial and punishing those who are guilty in fair trial proceedings. Also, when it comes to criminal accountability, using evidence to establish facts to know what happened, to tell stories about what happened, to remember, to, as a society or societies, to acknowledge harm. Very often when you talk to people that testify in proceedings or observe them, or victim communities, very often they feel it's very important to give the acknowledgement of harm in some kind of a public process. By doing these proceedings, I think it's important to send a message, be it internationally or domestically, that certain acts cannot be tolerated for the sake of everyone. Thus, for example, rape, murder, and torture are not something that's an ethnic issue, but those are atrocities and need to be punished as such. When it comes to reconciliation, I think it's important to discuss it in the context of criminal proceedings, but I think fundamentally courts cannot and should not be expected to reconcile anyone, because that's not what they were built for. In the aftermath of atrocity. For example, that is not something that we expect in a domestic murder trial. Domestically, when you go to court and you watch murder proceedings, the judge sentences someone to prison. The judge then at the end of the trial does not say to the victim family and to the perpetrator, now hug, or something along those lines. So I think internationally and in terms of war crimes proceedings, sometimes we expect things that are absolutely unrealistic. In the short term, actually, these proceedings often disrupt social relations. Look at any ICTY judgment. It often leads to disruption and sort of escalation in relationships, and not sort of a calming down effect that's understood to be sort of desired. As I often tell my students, demanding courts to reconcile is like going to the dentist and asking for a haircut. It's just the wrong address. It's not the place to seek that kind of a result. Courts should thus investigate and prosecute, and be expected to investigate and prosecute and conduct fair trials, both in terms of process and outcome, establish facts, and convict individuals based on evidence and law. That's what they're supposed to be doing. And finally, courts can bring a sometimes minor, sometimes frustratingly minor, sense of repair to individuals and to communities, and the already mentioned acknowledgement of harm. But we, as citizens, and here I speak also personally as a former Yugoslav myself, the work of reconciliation is to be done by us, by our politicians, by our intellectuals, teachers, activists, parents, dentists, religious leaders, media. It's our work. It's not going to come from a courtroom, either far away or within our own countries. It's us that need to be doing this work. And how, in this moment in history, I leave for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all four. I mean, I think one of the themes that actually, well, several themes come across, but I think one of the key themes that comes across here is that, you know, what you just said, you know, the kind of moving the differentiation of criminal proceedings and criminal accountability from justice as a wider concept, and then the really limited ability of these criminal proceedings to actually achieve reconciliation. And what James said at the beginning, and maybe wanted to expand a bit further on this kind of naive approach at the beginning of expecting that justice kind of this criminal justice approach would actually lead to reconciliation, and then to what extent do you feel that it actually potentially reduce the space, narrow the space for other types of activities, and to what extent do you see any evidence that, for example, so much focus on trials and on reconciliation, this need to reconcile, actually made us lose focus from other activities that are happening in parallel that actually could have led to this process if properly nurtured? You wanna? Yep. So.
Well, there's really rather a lot there to try to take on board and
You still only have 4 minutes.
address. I still only have 4 minutes. I haven't set the stopwatch this time. You'd better watch for me. First, whilst I support Eva's very final point, absolutely, people have to take responsibility and to do these things. I think it's not entirely right to say that courts don't have a role in reconciliation. Municipal courts dealing with criminal cases have a mission not only to punish, to deliver retributive justice, to enforce the law, but also to restore to victims. Restoration can be in the psychological sense that justice has been done, and one of the reasons that in some jurisdictions we have trial by jury, trial by a group of one's peers, is that there should be a sense of whether or not this meets the test of acceptability, that it's not merely a technical matter in law and so on. There's some understanding involved. And we also have programs of not universally applied, but available for those convicted of crimes to meet with their victims as a process of mutual understanding and coming to terms. The difference with the kinds of things we're talking about is that the scale is enormous, the politics is deeply important, the symbolism counts for so much, and that means that it's hard to get a hold of it, it's hard to get a grasp. The point I was making initially about that sense of naivety, and I wouldn't want to stress it too much, rested to a large extent in many people's minds on the experience of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg and the transformation of Germany after the Second World War. And the naivety was to think that it was the tribunal and the authoritative historical record that it had created alone which had done this. Of course it wasn't. Germany was occupied. There was a complete, across the spectrum, political, social, economic transformation taking place. As part of that, there was a lot of propaganda. So the US military film unit under Stuart Schulberg made films about Nuremberg that the Germans were obliged to go to the cinema and watch to see the process, to understand what was going on. So there was something of what we, in modern parlance, we might call an outreach program being delivered under a degree of compulsion, which has no parallel in the liberal environment of the 1990s onwards, the idea of letting people come to things for themselves, where there is no sense of occupation or compulsion involved. So we can't expect the same kinds of things. I'm not sure we could expect them if those things were in place, but we certainly can't if they're not in place. And I've forgotten the other bit that you said, and I can stop there, or you can remind me and I can deal with it.
I will stop you there, and so because we also want to give time for questions for the audience, because I would like to take another round with the speakers and then open to the audience. So Rachel, I was actually very privileged to somehow be involved with, on the sidelines of your project, and I was always, I think, this definition reconciliation, and this fact is how you try to approach it both historically and temporally in different contexts. To what extent is actually the concept still useful?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I think it is. For a long time I've been looking at transitional justice and started off looking at international criminal justice and shied away from this question of reconciliation for a long time and looked at justice and kind of subscribed to the view that expecting courts to deliver reconciliation was setting expectations too high, and that maybe there's some things that they can do around the edges. And maybe the record could be used as providing a space for that to happen, and a basis for dialogue. But in and of itself, I couldn't see how justice would do that. So now we've sort of come late to this, or come to this question of reconciliation and what is it? Because there seems to be this sense that it's so difficult to achieve, and then that sort of begs the question: well, what is it that we're trying to achieve? What constitutes reconciliation? What does it look like? We've had discussions about this within the project, because part of the difficulty with the term reconciliation is that it's so much resisted by people, even people working in sort of so-called reconciliation activities, kind of like resist this term, because it's become so loaded and because it's become so politicized. So then what do we do? Do we change and call it something else? Do we just call it coming to terms or contending with the past or something like that? But that doesn't quite capture what reconciliation might be. And I think there might be more mileage in trying to reframe and reconceptualize what we mean by reconciliation. And the work that we've been doing with the arts helps kind of push us in that direction, I think, because rather than when we went to look at the arts, we were thinking about the arts as instrumental, as a sort of a tool that could be used in reconciliation practices. But actually what it's opened up is this idea that it's a different idea of reconciliation, of creating space for something to happen in, and that can be contestation, it can be disruption just as much as it can be agreement. So reconciliation isn't necessarily about all holding hands and agreeing, but it's about a space in which those kinds of contestations can happen.
Thank you. Jelena, just for you, I mean, I think an interesting view and quite critical, and I think also quite fair, of the issues around evaluation of this work. And something that my own organization struggles a lot with on a daily basis. So I find this quite interesting. So how would you, do you see any prospects of improving this? And also, to what extent do you feel from your research on how this has been evaluated that we're then overly focusing on evaluating reconciliation, the impact of our work on reconciliation in projects or programs that are directly called like that, and we're ignoring all sorts of other activities that we're doing which actually might lead by proxy to this?
Thank you. I did not intend to be overly critical, but I unfortunately didn't find too many reasons to be very optimistic in the course of my research. How to improve the evaluation? Well, one of the first steps is to stop seeing evaluation as something that happens post factum, and to see evaluation as something that should be running in parallel to efforts to contribute towards any change, social change, including reconciliation. Something that would be a learning process rather than a critical process, or rather than a process of assessing to what extent we're ticking the boxes. Something that would allow flexibility and change, of course, in the middle of the program or an activity or a project, and adjustment to the actual environment and the heightened situational awareness. Provided that kind of understanding is appropriately kind of advocated, accepted, and understood by those who are engaged with the work of reconciliation, I would think that some improvement some space for improvement absolutely exists, but it is something that would require, obviously, a change of mindset of those who are engaging with reconciliation work. And to answer your second question, and that's a very good question. It's like how to measure an impact on a social change, and how to know what impacts it and what doesn't. And that is something that actually dictates us to look beyond the very rigid quantitative methods of evaluation, like log frame, logistical framework, where you set a set of parameters and measurements that you need to reach, which are much more appropriate, to more tangible projects, if you're building a bridge or digging a well, but not so much if you're measuring a change which is generational, and to which, for example, an infrastructural a project may contribute towards reconciliation as well. Increase of living standard may contribute as well as an activity that was specifically designed to target enhancing dialogue between different or former adversarial communities. One thing that I do want to mention is that in all those kind of measuring, evaluating, assessing, we should not forget that reconciliation targeting activities and efforts do not happen in vacuum. They all happen in one wider economic, political, and most importantly, media space, which often gets, to some extent, neglected, and their influence on the effectiveness of such activities in the long run gets neglected, and maybe that's something that we could discuss going on.
Thank you very much. Denisa, just for you, I mean, I was actually very intrigued on two things. One is, of course, your kind of focus on youth, and then on regional cooperation, in particular on regional cooperation, which, you know, kind of the regional aspect, actually, these kind of regional meetings, etc. And I think in some way there has been, you know, an understanding of that over the years, that, you know, the only way we could do this is through this kind of elevating things beyond just the particular country, but actually trying to connect everyone. Now, at the same time, I think the success of many of these initiatives, and I think officially there's about between 40 and 50 regional initiatives in the Western Balkans that's seeking to kind of, you know, integrate the region better, whether it's on economic questions, whether it's on transport, whether it's on, you know, things like gender and disaster risk reduction and emergency response, etc. So at the same time, I think, you know, the varying levels of success and integration there also show maybe, you know, that this is not always fully understood as a successful model. But secondly, to what extent do you feel now on the youth question that finally we're catching up on this issue, and that the bigger, you know, the kind of increase on attention on youth with the creation of initiatives like RICO, etc., are actually going to be able to contribute, or to what extent are we going to end up repeating the same mistakes of the past?
Quite a few questions wrapped up in there. So. Let me start with the youth one, but maybe just take it from the policy perspective. One thing that always puzzled me when we discuss EU is that, of course, you know, EU, the way it was created was is envisaged as a peace project, and that peace project, if you like, also sort of at its core had Franco-German cooperation and reconciliation. So if we look at the transitional justice and what's happened in the region, EU's conditionality policy, in other words, cooperation with the Hague Tribunal, on which advancement in the process of EU integration was conditioned, has been very important and initiated by the EU. And one thing that's always puzzled me was why, if the EU has considered this area so critical, why it hasn't approached it in a way that's worked for itself. In other words, why was such a huge emphasis only on retributive justice, which sidelined all those restorative elements, focus on the civil society, and particularly the focus on the youth, and in that context, on the exchanges. So we knew how important these kind of dynamics were sort of historically, as I said, in the EU, and how absent and unused and unexplored they are still in this region. RICO, I think, is a huge, obviously, a step forward, even though you could say it's coming a little bit too late. But I think this whole area, if you're allowed to think of sort of reconciliation as in terms of interventionism, sort of to flip it back and say, well, maybe some things have to be kind of enabled. I think holds a huge potential and necessary potential. And I would just say also, in terms of academic research, it's just beginning to get kind of sort of to scratch on the surface to get some understanding what's happening with the youth. And again, the picture that is emerging is actually much more complicated, and I would say even it's much more optimistic. If you see what the kids are hearing every day on the radio, the fact that they don't even have an opportunity to to get into contact with kids from other groups. You know, everything is stacked against reconciliation, and yet, you know, when they, you know, some initiatives that do bring them together, they do have unintended consequences, but they actually have unintended consequences in the opposite direction. Jelena was talking, and obviously this is a huge thing, that, you know, even the pursuit of criminal justice can have unintended consequences, that it divides communities rather than bringing them together. But also there are all these other kind of things going on which have unintended consequences but in a positive direction, right? Where kind of the threshold of expectation is quite low, and you get surprises where you don't expect them.
Thank you. Eva, I think one thing I would maybe like to reflect briefly on is the recognition that I think everybody is well aware of, that the proceedings could have negative consequences on the social context, etc. So, how do we deal with that? How do we combine what we're trying to achieve, or what is being tried to be achieved, with criminal proceedings, and then their potential negative impact on this broader idea of reconciliation?
Well, I think it's, again, a personal question in the sense that it comes down to sort of your priorities and what you feel is more important. Do you prioritize sort of, social cohesion in some way, and some kind of an understanding and agreement, and the fact that people can come together and agree on certain things, or, as I do, maybe, disruptive to reconciliatory attempts? I want people to go to prison, and sometimes, for me personally, it doesn't seem as important if people get angry for a couple of weeks, for a couple of days, for a couple of months. Other people, also I think legitimately, prioritize reconciliation, prioritize a sense of bringing people together and sort of trying to find more cooperative ways, less disruption in talking about it. And I really think it's a very difficult question to ask. It's really about strategic priorities. It's really about what all these actors coming into this discussion bring to the table. If you ask this victim, they might say this, or some other victim might say something else. But at the end of the day, I think there's groups which might prioritize something more than something else. And I think the million-dollar question is to try to find ways to tie those things together in a way that's going to bring communities together, even if at times they're very angry and very disruptive. And, because I think this process, and we referred to it also earlier, sometimes anger maybe is a part of, contestation maybe is a part of this process as well. I don't think we can expect it to be smooth sailing. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, all. I would like to open the floor now for questions from the audience. Are there any? No. Yes, please. I think we'll need a mic here at the front. Sorry. Yep. Two. Then.
Well, thank you very much. I'm Tom Countryman, U.S. State Department, now retired and irrelevant. It's fascinating. This is not really my field. Was particularly interested in Eva's description of trying to assess the justice part and not only the reconciliation part of today's topic. I was not involved in the Balkans at the time the ICTY was set up, but in my recollection, the discussion in the US government was not as much about reconciliation in the Western Balkans as it was about deterrence of future war crimes in the ex-Yugoslavia and elsewhere in the world. So kind of two questions about whether research has been done or is feasible on these two topics. Number one, is it feasible to have relatively non-political legal experts from across the former Yugoslavia sit down and try to make a common assessment of criminal accountability, not of reconciliation, but of the actual effectiveness, the actual record of the ICTY, and then a little more difficult, the effectiveness of the national war crimes courts in the various ex Yugoslav republics. And then the second question that I would have no idea how to do is there any attempt to measure whether the record of criminal accountability of the ICTY has had any kind of deterrent effect in the Balkans or in the rest of the world?
Thank you very much. We have a question over there, the lady. So we'll take 2-3 questions and then that one over there. So.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Kari Uslan from the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. I was wondering, any of you, if you could give a bit more meat on the bone, so to speak. I mean, to give some examples of type of reconciliation activities that you've seen in your research that either had some, I understand the problem of measuring these things, but that you think would have some positive effects and some that did not have that, either what you seem to call industries or more the everyday practices. Thank you.
Thank you, and over there, the gentleman.
Oliver Stanovski, Institute for Defense, Peace and Study from Skopje, Macedonia. Denisa, you mentioned that for solid process of reconciliation, we need brave politicians and committed people. In that terms, I will say one example. In Macedonia in 2001, conflict produced some cases of obvious war crimes that under some circumstances were annulled or amnested by political elites in 2011. My question is it good to have so brave politicians to put this thing under the table in sense of good process of reconciliation? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can take a round of answers. So, if whoever wants to start, James.
I'm going to start over here with examples. And I think examples come back to the question of what level are we talking. At the end of the introductory remarks I said about the arts, but it applies to anything, whether you're dealing at a high level in symbolism, whether you're dealing with groups at a practical level, or whether it's maybe just about an individual or a number of individuals coming to terms. One of the best examples, I would say, of some form of reconciliation, and recognizing what Rachel was saying about the many different ways in which we take this, we can go back to the dictionary, look at the etymology, reconcilio, bring the council back together, put something together, but that can mean many things. One of the best examples, but also shows the downside to me, is the Bosnian Defense Force. Here you have the elements of 3 armies that were on different sides, brought together by external impetus, but actually taking on and owning a process, making it their own. Now, the political machinations of Mr. Dodik in the RS have done some things to undermine that at the level of the cooperation and integration, the formation of a common defense force. But that is still a remarkable success story. And yet, I can tell you, when I was lecturing in Sarajevo, which is now mainly a Muslim canton university, the Sarajevo University, the students reject the idea that this is a success story, because a lot of the thinking there is about revenge, about a future war that's going to come. Because going back to this notion of justice was not done, so another kind of justice needs to be exercised at some point, perhaps one day when it comes. I mean, I'll go into that more detail, but when the time. A different kind of example coming from the courts is, and you can see different individuals, but there's one Mrs. Hodgic in the trial of Dragan Nikolic, victim witness, who just begged to know what had happened to her sons. And the visual, and this is one of the things that leads us to the arts and visual arts, the different things, you can see the transformation of this poor woman when she's finally told some information about what did happen to her sons, that the last glimmer of hope is gone, but there's a bit of settling. She becomes a victim again because everybody's watching this as it happens. But I think we can see in that moment the start of something. So it depends at which level we're talking and what kinds of examples we're looking for. Maybe one of my colleagues will talk about some of the more practical examples. We've been involved in drawing workshops, activities that bring people together, but preferably not by using the label reconciliation for sure, because if you do that, puts people off. But you can get them to come together. But that's also, what does the coming together mean? Does it mean something psychological, effective has happened, that there's a transformation? Does it just mean that on the surface people are coming together in some way? At the large symbolic political levels, is it just about cooperation, some degree of cooperation? I think at the diplomatic level, Denise made reference to the Berlin process, the Western Balkans summit. At that level, people are very happy to understand reconciliation simply to mean a political accommodation, people talking to each other, coming together, and preferably agreeing on some things. Deterrence, the evidence is quite clear that on the whole, there is no deterrent effect from an international tribunal. The most acute example of that is the behavior of General Mladic at Srebrenica. For sure, he and many of his people for a long time, even before the creation of the tribunal, being careful to be ambiguous, to dodge around the edges, not to leave clear and explicit records as far as possible of things that were done. So it's clear that they knew they were doing wrong and they knew they wanted to avoid anything if it happened. But Srebrenica was such an act of egregious hubris, really. He believed that he could do everything and that nothing could be done against him. Turned out to be wrong, thankfully, but I'm doing it. The one example of deterrence working is that of the end of the Kosovo conflict, where President Slobodan Milosevic changed his position 180 degrees within 1 week, and that 1 week was within the tribunals issuing an indictment against him for the first time, completely changing his perspective on the world and what it meant. And he moved very quickly at that point to get out of armed action, to move away. But I think it's the only example I could point to from the record of the tribunal or any of the other modern manifestations of international criminal action where deterrence has been a factor. But I was interested to hear the sense that in the US State Department at the time of the discussions and the creation that this was an issue, because I don't think anybody in particularly otherwise would have taken it seriously. And I thought they had some other ideas in mind, but that's it.
Anybody else wants to take that? Eva?
I would just like to continue sort of on this notion and respond to the gentleman that used to work at the State Department and touch upon what James was saying. I think in deterrence, in order for it to work, it needs to be a credible threat that you will be prosecuted. In relation to the Mladic case, for example, at the time when Srebrenica was taking place, the ICTY was very young, and it didn't, I think, have enough teeth for the general to fear it. In relation to some of the other sort of assessments of deterrence, I live in The Hague and I talk to a lot of researchers that study, among other things, deterrence as well. It's very difficult to research something that didn't happen. That's what researchers always say. And the second thing is that, again, in order for deterrence to work, for example, in contexts like the Democratic Republic of Congo or in other contexts, the warlords and the perpetrators need to think that there's a statistical chance, a credible chance that they will end up in court. And if you look at sort of the numbers in all of these proceedings and the limitations of jurisdiction, it's actually quite unlikely if you're a criminal warlord, especially if you're a lower-level perpetrator, to end up prosecuted. And I often hear the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Fatou Bensouda, she talks about the same 2 or 3 instances of anecdotal evidence of deterrence. I've heard her given the same examples for 10 years. The fact that she gives the same examples is an indication that there's not that much there to cite, I think. So I think credible threat is what we need the courts to be universal enough for most perpetrators to think I will be prosecuted either internationally or nationally. And just the domestic sort of aspect, I worked at the Special War Crimes Department 10 years ago in Sarajevo, and we did a project with the OSCE, counting all open case files. We came up with a number of about 5,000 people that could credibly be investigated. So credible suspects, which doesn't mean that you can prosecute them, but there's 5,000 people that you could be looking at. Now, everyone will know that there's no way any judicial system can prosecute 5,000 people in the context, for example, of Bosnia. There's no country, even countries like Sweden or the US, you can't prosecute 5,000 people just like that. You would need to stop prosecuting traffic violations and murders and all these other kinds of things. So in the former Yugoslavia, BIRN counted about 600 people that were prosecuted internationally and domestically. 600 people is actually not that bad. And I think comparatively, the former Yugoslavia is not doing that badly in terms of prosecution. The problem is that the ICTY is closed, the mixed is about to be closed, and the domestic prosecutions are dwindling. The political will is gone or on the way out the door for prosecution. So that's what worries me and other experts in this field, that domestically, Serbia, Croatia, and to a little bit of a lesser extent, Bosnia, countries are doing this. The ICTY is closed, we can all close up shop and go home. Thank you.
So do you want to come back on that, or because I've got the other speakers as well? It's up to you.
I did want to add something, if I may.
Yep,
yeah. I wanted to go back and add on the deterrence question. I didn't say that the mission, as stated by the UN Security Council resolution authorizing the statute and tribunal, was to restore and maintain international peace and security. And in that context, I think the deterrent effect is that the sum of the work will remove the conditions for continuing or ultimately future armed conflict. And I think both in the instrumentalization of the tribunal through the detention of war crime suspects and prosecution, i.e. moving people who are political obstacles out of the way, allowing things to move forward, it's been a success. And we never know the things we can't prove until they actually go wrong and happen. Yeah, it continues with that mission of deterring future armed hostilities. But I think in that context, we have to recognize that it was focused on individuals, but has this wider political social mission, and reconciling the two is not so easy. And the issue about deterrence is really about enforcement. It was an enforcement measure, but it had no accompanying enforcement capability itself. It relied on the member states. So your own country for a long time, whilst enormously committed to the tribunal itself, was reluctant when it came to the matter of actually, in practice, doing things to detain people. My country, by contrast, had people who were very keen and prepared to go out and detain people, but had a bunch of lawyers who were saying, oh, we're not sure if you can do that, if it would be legal to do it. And so these kind of debates go on for a long time until you get to a point where something actually happens that makes it go, but without the enforcement measure. Yeah, most criminals are deterred not by the prospect of the criminal trial, but by the prospect that the police will come and arrest them and incarcerate them somewhere, whatever comes to the trial. And when we talk about trials, we then got the notion of what's in the public interest, and sometimes prosecutors decide, even if there's evidence, it's not in the public interest to move ahead, and these are all issues to consider.
Rachel and Jelena.
I just wanted to respond to the question about substance and examples, and give a couple of concrete examples from the work that we've done and from other things as well. So, I mean, I guess the first thing to say is it depends what you think reconciliation is, as James said, and it depends where what sort of level you're looking at. So in terms of individual reconciliation with their own stories and the idea of closure, then the missing persons initiative's been really important. But in terms of sort of group reconciliation, or this idea of opening up space for meetings and dialogue, I think Denise was saying about youth is really important, that youth is a really significant area to work with. And actually, one of the projects that we've been privileged to be involved with is with the Post-Conflict Research Centre, Tatiana, who's sitting over there. And it's a project called Balkan Discourse Youth. And it's not explicitly a reconciliation project, but it's a project that brings together youth and trains them in journalistic techniques, and then they go out and pursue their own stories. but the sort of bringing them together to work together and the kinds of things that they decide to investigate for their journalism work, I think contributes to this idea of reconciliation, this idea of sort of increasing contact and increasing collaboration between different groups who might not otherwise come together and see each other given segregated schools, etc. So that's really important. And the second thing that I would mention would be education initiatives. And another thing that we've done in the project is work with the Sarajevo History Museum of Bosnia and Herzegovina, to create an exhibition, commission some artwork, which was a response to their exhibition on the siege of Sarajevo. And one of the things that one of our project partners, who's not here today, Paul Lowe, has been doing in Sarajevo is bringing in groups of students and teachers, history teachers, to engage with the exhibition and then with the permanent exhibition of the siege of Sarajevo. And in particular, the arts stuff gives them another way in to start talking about the siege of Sarajevo and start talking about some of these issues that they can't cover because of the constraints in the textbooks that they're given and the constraints in the curriculum and the way that it's taught. So that also has been quite important. And I know Jelena Krstić at the Humanitarian Law Centre has brought the exhibition, the Siege of Sarajevo exhibition, to Belgrade as well, and done some of the same work in bringing in young people to engage with it. So I think those are the two sort of substantive things that I would mention.
Thank you. Jelena?
Well, one of the first things in answering your question, what works, is that I'd go back to my issue, the issue that I raised, that we don't really know what works because there is no systematic evaluation. And, you know, if you look at the project reports, you know, if an organization tells you we can bring 2,000 children and have them in a camp where they will be playing sports for a week, can they do that? Does that work? As a project, yes, they probably can bring 2,000 children from different ethnic backgrounds into a camp where they will play sports together for a week. But to what extent are those children going to go home changed? To what extent are they going to influence their parents and spread what they've learned about other groups? That's not assessed, that's not measured. And there's only a handful. I mean, of course, there are notable exceptions, and that perhaps can add some meat to the bone. Rachel already mentioned a few, but first we have to understand that we're talking about a micro level or medium level, or even a macro level. The number of organizations that do evaluation is very, very small. We scanned around 500 different activities. We looked into 60 different organizations, from donors to practitioners. And from the handful of those who do evaluation that extends into impact, assessing the impact, again, only a handful of those will make those evaluations public and available for others to learn from them. And a great example is actually a micro level organization from Bosnia in Brčko. There is a small NGO called Svitac. And it's a group of local enthusiasts, 3 of them actually, who decided that they don't want to participate in the segregation of children. They wanted to do something about it. So what they established kind of a mini youth center where they're working with preschool and school children, but young school children, creating a lot of different content for them to participate together, not counting how many kids from this group or that group they've got. And over a period of years, they have been doing evaluation, and they've noticed an increase, not only in interest, like word of mouth, that more and more parents started bringing their children, but they have also noticed that more and more parents started spending time together, and they have been doing some evaluations of how their attitudes towards other ethnic groups in Brčko have been changing. So that, for example, would be, I think, a good representative of the micro-level working initiative.
Thank you, Denisa. Please.
Yes, okay. Well, I would like to actually respond to 2 questions in the same answer. And start with some statistical findings from conflict studies, one very pessimistic and one optimistic. So one pessimistic finding is that the biggest predictor of conflict recurrence is a conflict, right? So areas that have had conflict are very likely, controlling for other factors, to have another conflict. And that is quite frightening if we look at the region and the start of the conflict, beginning of 1990s. It's kind of almost coming into that dangerous stage that might be sort of a possibility if we look at sort of large statistical studies of all conflicts. The second finding is, as this field of transitional justice is developing, and scholars can again look at, compare conflicts, different peace agreements, and the outcomes. Increasingly kind of robust and growing evidence that if there are transitional justice mechanisms which are included in a peace agreement, this prolongs the peace. So it does have, so including transitional justice provisions into peace agreements has effects for the longevity of peace. So if you like, these are kind of two sort of almost opposite things, and which kind of leads me to answer your question. And it's a question about kind of how do we understand transitional justice and the choices that are made or not made in how to address the legacy of human rights violations and mass atrocity. And I think it's really important here to take on board that this is not just a question of justice, or if you like, I don't want to demean the term, but almost kind of symbolic justice, whether victims can be satisfied or their pain can be acknowledged. This is all very, very important. But I think at the core of the idea when we speak about transitional justice, there are two ideas. One is it's a transitional justice, right? So it is justice that is happening in a period of flux where basically a social and political order is moving, right? It's being reassembled after the conflict, which creates a whole load of constraints of what is to be done and not. In the context of ethnic conflicts, there is very rarely a clean slate solution, if you like, as there was, for example, in Germany with the total defeat, which introduces another layer of constraints on what can be done. But also, I think, and here I would have to quote one of the biggest scholars in the field, Ruti Teitel, who talks about transitional justice being constitutive of transition. So basically, the choices that are political choices that are made, how to address the legacy of war crimes, actually tells a lot, not just about the justice, but about the kind of democracy and in the making in a given context. So therefore, it is really important, sort of beyond this, again, as I said, a symbolic dimension of justice.
Thank you. I'd like to take maybe another round of questions if there's any. No? Yeah, we only have actually a few more minutes. So basically maybe, yes, please.
I wanted to add another example to the list of things, because I don't think I said this before. Gorazda in Bosnia and Herzegovina is a remarkable minor economic success that carries with it a form of reconciliation, coming together kind of success, but one that is qualified. I mean, the story is that somebody, kind of, the car factory used to be there, built out, works with Volkswagen in Germany, making parts. There's a very successful dynamic around this. It's brought people in from different parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also from outside Bosnia and Herzegovina, from neighboring countries. So it's bringing people together around a dynamic of employment and well-being and success. So that's one level you could say is a form of coming together and doing it. But we have to leaven that with the understanding that people still live in parallel silos alongside each other. People living alongside each other, getting on day to day, is maybe not a bad thing, but it's not the deep level of reconciliation that some people look for, that maybe is not so much reconciliation as grace and forgiveness and a real coming together, the kind of thing that I think Eva rightly earlier on was saying you can't really expect. If certain things have happened to people, it does happen sometimes, depends on personalities, individuals. But we can't really expect people who've been the victims of some of the most awful things imaginable, either personally or in their families, to do that. So, but we can look at, again, it's a question of levels and types of activity and the things that we register, and whether or not we register them as being something to note.
Okay, thanks. Maybe what I'd like to ask the panel now is for kind of a final round of 1 minute each on thoughts on two things. One is, considering also the complexity of defining even reconciliation understanding, but still going back to, the theme of our panel, how do you judge the prospects in the Balkans? And another sub-question to this is, how do we link the multiple? I know in 1 minute it's a challenge, but I know you can all do it. How do we link the multiple levels, right? The individual reconciliation from the, collective, etc. And how, is it even possible to measure something like this? So maybe we start from Eva this time.
I wasn't ready with making my notes, but let me try and improvise. I will just limit myself to trials. I think it's really important to pay attention in the region that the reasonable successes that were made domestically with war crimes prosecution are slipping away or have slipped away, and that people living here in Bosnia and in my home country of Croatia have murderers and rapists living around you, working around you, on the same bus and on the same tram that you use. And I would say that you should really, and we should really focus our attention on trying to build up the political will to continue with this important process. There's no statutory limitations. The only thing limiting prosecutions is biology. When people are dead, then you can't prosecute them. But as a, for example, Croatian citizen, I think it's really important to insist that people are prosecuted, because I do not want to live with murderers. That's it.
I think that one of the huge challenges that we have is to move away from assessing reconciliation as an outcome, and to understand how to assess and better understand reconciliation as a process in terms of some, if you like, measurables that will be relevant. And this is why, for example, for me personally, it's been quite interesting to study the recon process, the consultations that took place when this initiative discussed how to approach the legacy of war crimes. And in this context, I would like to just, if I may, go a little bit beyond the region. And that is, I think the whole RECOM initiative really spotlighted something which is very important globally, and that is, and this is, I can also throw statistics at you in terms of the features of contemporary conflict. So in the post-Cold War period, not only do we have an increase in ethnic wars, but the increasing proportion of those wars have cross-border dimensions. And this creates huge, huge problems in how do you prosecute or whatever deal with war crimes if your approach is national, and if, for example, perpetrators and victims are across the live on different sides of the border. And I think RECOM initiative was one way that tried to look at it differently by bringing representatives of different ethnic groups together. And I think in this context, the Balkans can also be and should be used to better understand sort of the type of response to conflict, to better understand justice needs and how you address them sort of more comprehensively, more appropriately, so you don't end up with what other scholars are calling transitional injustice. And if you look at, for example, Syria, that was one obvious kind of example where any experiences in terms of kind of regional approaches, or call them cross-border approaches, would be very, very applicable.
Thank you. Jelena?
I would like to just point out that we shouldn't make a mistake of observing reconciliation as an isolated process, that we should always bear in mind that it happens in parallel with other social and economic processes, that it's interconnected with them. And in that sense, given the situation in the region, the frozen conflicts, the endemic corruption, the low living standards, yes, I would say that, and again, I highly stress this is my personal opinion, I am not an optimist. For me, it's not a question of whether, it's a question of when will be the next conflict.
Well, on that happy note, Rachel?
On the question of, I mean, the panel is about justice and reconciliation, so I've sort of been thinking about this relationship between the two things, and certainly with the ICTY, I think we talked a bit about its legacy and what it can do and can't do. I think probably the best assessment I've seen of it is that it was necessary but insufficient. So necessary for a whole host of reasons, insufficient as a means of contending with the past or bringing reconciliation. So given that it's there, I think one of the negative aspects, I think, of the ICTY is that it's so dominated the discourse around war crimes and around what to do with the legacy of war crimes, that it crowded out the space for anything else to be happening. Now, earlier on, there wasn't space for anything to be happening anyway, but later on, possibly something might have been able to happen earlier. But I think the challenge now is to sort of take all of that on board and look forward and think about how the legacy of the ICTY and how these other initiatives can be supported to try and make some inroads, whether they're small ones in small projects, and how you can kind of get a critical mass from that and expand it up. And I think the RECOM initiative is one that's been really important, but these sort of smaller projects too. So build on what's underway. But in terms of prospects, I mean, what I'm hearing here, and certainly from Jelena, but from others at the forum as well, is a strong note of pessimism, which is concerning. So I don't know how you get around that, because I think the point that this occurs in a political context is right, and the strength of the media and the strength of the narratives that are constantly being put forward is difficult to try and unsettle through these initiatives.
Thank you. James, 1 minute.
I rather thought I'd had my 1 minute just before, but I can be greedy and say two last things. The main thing is that in a situation which in parts of this region appears increasingly to be fragile, Bosnia and Herzegovina in categorizations has moved from being post-conflict to pre-conflict. The EU needs to show some courage, because irrespective of the justice aspect, the strategic dynamic for this region depends on that which the EU can offer and the embrace which it can give. It's failed regarding Macedonia and leaves Macedonia hanging on a fragile thread. It needs, most of all, to show action regarding Serbia, where we are now, because Serbia is the pivot strategically to the developments in the whole region. I don't have time to go into the logic that follows, but if the EU has the courage, clearly, to offer the embrace to Serbia, not just vaguely, and if there's this and that and the other, then there is a chance to create a dynamic which will foster political processes that will lead towards levels of cooperation and reconciliation. But that also needs courage from the Serbian authorities to take full responsibility, to be accountable for things that happened in the past, to make sure that the pathways to the future are clear.
Thank you very much.
The second thing is that while we talk about this region and reconciliation, maybe we can learn from the experience and prepare for the reconciliation that will be needed after the mess that's Brexit. Hopefully without war crimes.
I would like to ask you to join me in thanking our panel. I thought it was an excellent overview of where we stand on very complex topics. So thank you very much. Right on time.